for having me, everybody. Thank you for coming. So what happens if you expose a 10-year-old boy to Jaws and the violence of RoboCop and the horror and weirdness of aliens? I had an older brother, so maybe my parents could blame the fact that he was watching them, so therefore I was just along for the ride. And maybe you could blame me because whatever my brother was doing, I had to do as well. But you could possibly also blame the fact that my parents were filmmakers. So they would often be watching movies and television shows of all sorts all the time and just absorbing all of the sort of the lessons and the minutiae of the filmmaking business. So it was like I was raised by craftspeople. My mother was a director, much like Steven Spielberg, who I still have nightmares about sharks. I love scuba diving, but I'm always on the lookout at all times, and I try and make sure that I'm in the middle of a pack of scuba divers so that if a shark comes, it gets them first and I have time to swim in the other direction. So my parents both worked really hard, so they didn't have a lot of time for chores. It was often down to me and my brother, but this is sort of a symbol for how they would vacuum up inspiration from all different areas, and how when they watched something like Jaws, they would take lessons from the storytelling, the structure, and just how to make impact, which is something that sort of stuck with me a lot, is how commercial art can have an impact on someone that is memorable. So with filmmaker parents in Wellington, I kind of did, I guess, what was expected of me. It's a fairly predictable route. I went to Massey, I studied animation. I did little bits of illustration, but never quite sort of fit in there. I had quite a few lucky breaks, I guess, because of the industry that my parents were in. I'd already done little bits of work, so got a job at Weta quite early on. So sort of, in some ways, everything was going right, everything was going the way that it should. And there I learnt about, costume design and sort of character design and how to build sets and how to sort of bring the emotion of a story into a physical or a visual way. It was also super intimidating because, I was a young guy, I was like 22, and I was surrounded by who I thought were some of the best illustrators and conceptual designers in the world. If there were 50 great film designers, 20 of them were like in the room that I was in. Which was awesome because I could steal a lot of stuff, and everyone just sort of nicks from each other. You could go over there and be like, how do you do that? And I saw that illustration you did yesterday, and steal that little bit over there. And so the refinement of craft was like really fast. The trajectory of growth was awesome. I also managed to work for two of my favorite directors from when I was a kid. Got to work on Tintin for Spielberg, who I never met, so break that illusion. And James Cameron on Avatar, and he was a pretty awesome dude. Aliens was definitely high up there on my childhood fantasies. But, it had its tough parts as well, For all of the potential, I kind of felt constrained. I was sort of playing in somebody else's sandbox. And I was kind of slowing down the early excitement of learning and nicking things, and I could see my development sort of starting to peter out. I don't know where I was, but I certainly wasn't at the top, but I could kind of sense that the longer I stayed there, the less growth I would make, but I would just be sort of like refining my craft. And it was sort of a struggle I had, is that I was just going in one direction and getting better and better and better at it. But there were all these other things that interested me that were outside of my sphere of influence. It did have that sense of being a cog in a beautiful machine, but still just a small part of it. And when I think back about what excited my parents, there were producers and directors, and a director is sort of a steerer of the ship and a master of all aspects. You know, they need to know about story structure, they need to know performance, they need to know music, they need to know composition, they need to know words. And here I was just sort of like narrowly drilling down into, you know, like how to make hair look like it's backlit. So I sort of decided, well, what happens if I jump off the path before it starts slowing down, and I just sort of start another path, and then maybe at the end I can have 3 things that are sort of like pretty good, rather than one thing that's amazing but it takes me like 25 years to get there, and then maybe I'm a bit bored. So I quit, which was a really tough decision for me. Guillermo del Toro had just been assigned to The Hobbit. He's like one of my favorite directors of all time. I didn't get to work on Lord of the Rings because I missed that boat due to being at university and being inexperienced. But I was just getting a bit worn down, and being surrounded by so many awesome people, I could tell that their passion for that specific craft was higher than mine, and I was never going to be able to catch up. I'd always just I'd go home and play computer games and watch movies, and they'd go home and they'd just keep drawing, you know, and we'd come up to work the next day and I'd be like, did you see that movie? And they'd be like, no, did you see this painting I did last night? You're just like, ah. So I escaped to Asia. I went with my then partner, now wife. We lived in South Korea and taught English for a while. I spent my mornings and my evenings writing a comic and building this sort of like entire world around it. And it was my own sandbox, and so that was great because I could explore lots of things, but I was responsible for everything. So if I wanted a logo, I had to do the logo. If I wanted to design the graphic packaging, and I had to design the graphic packaging. If I wanted to do the typography, I had to do the typography. So I started having to learn a whole bunch of stuff that I hadn't learned before. And one of the things is story. So much like a film script, comics are written first before they're drawn. And this is a quote from Andrew Stanton. I've always felt that you unearth story like you're on an archaeological dig. So that's something that sort of stuck with me, the idea that everything is there already, and it's just spending the time and being patient and unearthing what it is. So it's not building, it's digging down. And that was sort of certainly true with my comic. The other thing that I learned over that period was to drape art on top of structure. So in film and comics, there's this thing called the hero's journey. A lot of movies sort of you watch, especially the mainstream ones, they follow like a fairly consistent path. In a lot of ways, it's the way I think about design process now. It's like you've got to save some space for creativity, but if you can just drape that on a structure that's always the same with a couple of tweaks here and there, then you can sort of free up your creative space for the little bits and pieces. The other thing that sculptors, sort of reductive sculptors, like people who work in wood or marble do, is they start broad and then they bring it in. I don't know if you've seen any like Bob Ross videos. He never starts with, you know, the beautiful spiritual trees. He always starts with the broad canvas and he's just sort of swashing stuff across. So I try to think of design and comics in that same way. You start broad and then you work inwards. I finally moved back to Wellington and I took a bit of a plunge. I crossed the threshold, so to speak. I needed to stop working for myself because comics is great, but you make just enough money in comics to buy craft beer and then you're done for the week. And I was looking around, and a lot of my friends who were doing illustration and also doing a bit of freelance had worked for Garage Project already, and it was getting a little bit embarrassing that everyone I knew had done stuff for them except for me. So I decided, rather than just cold call, I'll just cold walk in. So I walked through the door there and met a lovely man called Ian and showed him some stuff. And he was like, oh, yep, cool, yep, I'll put you in touch with people. And pretty swiftly I was working on my first packaging, which was umami and mecha hop. So there were so many new challenges for me at this point. I had like no idea what I was doing, but I was enthusiastic and I was willing to take stuff on. And it was just a really exciting sort of like time for my work. Totally out of my depth. Do you know how to do screen printing? Yes, of course I do. And then sort of like rush away and figure out how to do it. So a lot of freelancers and creatives, I think we need mentors. So I had friends who had been freelancing longer than me that I could sort of go to with questions and problems, and they could help me out. And that could be from technical art stuff that I could steal again, or it might be like, this is how you work with a brief, or how you work with a client. And if all else failed, I could just Google it. So again, it was trying to work with the guys at Garage Project to find the brief a lot of the times. It was often a part of an idea, and then what we would do as a team is we would dig down into that idea, find the themes of it, and then try and get some visual cues that we could connect to that, build up a bit of a visual language that then we could rely on for the rest of the work. So we did it's a delicious beer called Mutiny on the Bounty, which is a dark Pacific stout. It's got breadfruit, it's got Tahitian vanilla, it's got a whole bunch of yummy, yummy things. And the Bounty was a famous sort of story about some British sailors who mutinied after visiting Tahiti and having a great time there, and then the captain was like, okay, well, we got to keep going now. And they were like, actually, I think maybe we'd rather go back to Tahiti. So they sort of kicked him off and they went back. So this was the packaging that we did for that. So it was using a lot of the maps of the time, the journey of the mutiny, and then sort of harking back to some of these sort of old classic boys' own stories and packaging, and getting a sense of the period. And a lot of the work that I do, I try and think of packaging as a costume. So it's sort of the Weta gag, it's like, who is the character, what do they want, where are they going, where have they come from, and what are they trying to sort of like put across. So that's the costume for Mutiny on the Bounty. The other thing that I sort of had driven home to me working at Garage Project is you have to make it memorable. So it's like Jaws, like that movie is just there all the time. Every time I go swimming, every time I'm near the water, like I can't help but think of it. So try and make something memorable. This is not my design, but it's very memorable, and I put it up, one, because it's really good, and two, because everybody asks whether this is mine, and I'm just getting that out of the way. Did not do this. Here are three that I did do. So Happy Days was one of the earliest ones. We had a lot of fun hiding little native birds or native insects around the sides of the can in all different places. There's a couple of little small things that you can only really see if you explore. White Mischief is a little bit of a visual illusion. Some people see it immediately, some people take a little while. Hops on Point is a beer that we did with the New Zealand Ballet. So amongst all the ornate, beautiful gold hop leaves, there is a tiny little dancer. So rather than doing the simple beer, I was trying to find ways to make these packages memorable so that people would stick to them, and sort of like a year later they could be drinking it with a friend and be like, did you notice this? Which sort of got me into a bit of trouble because there's nothing in this at all. And when I went up to the can factory where they were printing it, I got accosted by one of the staff there who I'd worked with on all the other ones. And she came in and she said, I've been bloody looking at this thing for half an hour and we've gone around the office and we can't see anything. And I was just like, oh yeah, no, there's nothing in that one. And in some ways, this was like a bit of a fail for me. You know, like this beer doesn't stick in anyone's mind. A lot of people don't remember that this beer came out. It's a truffle porter, by the way. So that's this. If you cut a big truffle in half, that's the sort of the pattern of the interior of a truffle. But I should have spent a bit longer and chucked some stuff in. Then I had a little bit of a crisis of faith. So that's the real one. It's not actually our baby, but you guys don't know that. To be fair, I probably wouldn't be able to tell the difference anyway. But we got pregnant, and we wanted to have a lifestyle where we could take time away and we could spend it with our child rather than having everyone go straight back to work. But freelancing as the single income was pretty terrifying. And so the temptation was, I'll go and get a day job again. I'll go back to Weta, which was a bit scary, but I knew that I could probably get back in, and I could probably get 50 hours a week at a decent wage, and I might never come back out, but I could support the family. And then we came up with another idea. My wife did actually. She was like, well, let's just move to Featherston, where it's really cheap. And then if you suck at freelancing, it's okay. So we moved there about 3 years ago, and the mortgage is very low, and life is good. And it sort of kept me relaxed enough that my minimum income to live was so much lower that I could have a quiet week, or I could have 3 quiet weeks and sort of carry us through. And it gave me the confidence to sort of throw myself back into freelancing full time and put to bed this idea of getting a day job. And all these sort of new opportunities started coming up. I felt like I had more time. I definitely had more drive. I didn't have more time. I had a kid, but I had more motivation. So I was out looking a lot more. And I got what looked on the face of it a really good opportunity from a small brew pub in Brisbane called All In. And they wanted to do a rebrand, and they'd seen some of the stuff I'd done for some coffee places and a cider place in the States. And I was like, yep, absolutely, love to do it. Never done a rebrand before. This will be great. And we worked on it for about 3 months. And I was like, not sure about the ladies. I kind of get it. There's a part of me when I was studying that was really into sort of pop art, pin-up art from a technical perspective has always enticed me, but I'm old enough and wise enough now to kind of have some reservations about something like this. But I thought maybe I could make it work. Maybe I could change this in a way where it would be palatable to me, to my wife, and to the broad, diverse range of people who drink beer. And I was wrong, and I couldn't do it. And it was a really awkward sort of phone conversation. We had a logo, we had some packaging concepts, and I had to have a Skype where I was just like, guys, I don't think we should do this anymore. And if you really want to do it, then I don't think it's with me. And it was super awkward. And I think what was hard is that they had worked with me enough that they kind of got it. I sort of convinced them that this wasn't viable, but there was nothing there. I didn't have any alternative for them. So they were kind of like, well, if it's not girls, then like, what is it? I was just like, I don't know. And then we just sort of like sat there. And then I kind of went back to some of the things I'd done with the comic, and I was like, okay, well, let's just start from ground zero and we'll just start digging down. And we'll see if we can unearth something else. So I did something that I'd never done before, and I tried to think like a brand person rather than an illustrator. And I started to think like a comic book person or someone who likes movies. And I was like, okay, so what's the story? And I did a pitch for them, and this is most of the pitch. So it uses some of what they already had and some stuff that I'd drawn up from having conversations with them. And these were really nice guys. Like they had a brew pub in a weird part of Brisbane. They had charity nights, they had pub quizzes, they had live music. You know, they had people of all sorts coming in, but their branding was not inclusive. So we looked at the story. It was like, okay, it's a beer without an MBA. It's not a commercial, cynical business. It's an underdog story. The name came from the idea that Harley, the founder, went all into this business. He mortgaged his house. He turned down all other opportunities, and he just put it all on the table and started a brewery. It was about playing the odds, and it was about creating a local inn for people. So the brew pub is a place that people who work locally or live locally can come together and hang out. The values that they had but they weren't showcasing were inclusive, approachable, social, and unpretentious. Brewing as an art form and as a business ranges from relaxed, free-spirited, and spontaneous through to planned and even compulsive. And play has the same effect on people. Play is an interest or enjoyment in tasks or games that bring people together and form bonds. Play makes good times and easy interactions. Play is invigorating, not ideological. Play is about connection, not capitalism. The Inn. The Inn is a meeting house for people to socialise, gossip, and form relationships within their community. Stuff that they do at the brew pub involves darts, puzzles, free music, pinball, board games, charity events, and arcade games. So what I was pitching to them was the idea of to gather around, to bring people together with play. And then I had to find out, okay, so if I've convinced you this far, like what does that look like? It's not a girl anymore. So we needed some visual metaphors. So going right back to the original name that was like 7 years old but had nothing to do with anything else was playing cards. So we kept digging a little bit further. We did more research. Threw the old logo away, and then the logo that we'd just done, and then the 4 other logos I'd gone through in the past, and came up with a new one. So again, it was riffing on the sort of like the card idea of sort of like the royal cards, the face cards. A local inn with an inclusive approach and quality beer. And then what do the new beers look like? So in New Zealand we have tap badges, which are these sort of circular things that you see where people pour the beer. In Australia they use sort of decal cards. I was just like, well, this is convenient. Put some playing cards on them. So each beer, and there are now I think about 26 of these that I've done, is still a character because that was important to them, but all of the names were gone. All of the terrible puns about, like the foxy red is, sensual and vivacious and all that stuff is out. And we're trying to come up with new ways of doing it. And reflecting stuff like the gameplay of, computer games or ironic uses of the words, and just going really broad and really fun with it. So this was the first one that we did, and this sort of convinced them that I wasn't a complete moron and that maybe it was worth the risk of changing every single thing that they ever had and sort of starting from scratch. And the thing that I'm always trying to do is, just to keep it memorable and try and have that impact that I remember from the movie. And I'm not going to show my daughter's Jaws just yet, but I did. I tried to show my oldest one when she was about 2.5 Finding Nemo, and conveniently it started after Nemo's mum was already dead, so that would have been a disaster. But instead it started right at the scene where like the shark shows up, which is called like Jeffrey, something weird. Bruce, Bruce the shark. And it, she didn't finish the scene. It was still a disaster, but I was kind of like, oh, well, maybe this will work out okay. Maybe 20 years from now, she'll be fine. And that's it.